In my opinion, the layer panel is often misunderstood and neglected by many of the users of After Effects. And I love the layer panel. I couldn't live without it. And I really recommend that new users get to know the layer panel because it can really improve your workflow to do a lot of your work in the layer panel as opposed to doing everything in the composition. If you imagine I've got 40 layers and I'm always working in the composition view, I'm always having to wait for all the layers to update. But by working in the layer panel, I can work on one layer at a time and even isolate effects and work on effects one at a time without having to wait for all the other layers to render. So it can improve efficiency working in the layer panel. If you want to follow along here, we're in Layer Panel AEP, which you can find in the Fine-Tuning Animation folder. And in here, I have a composition. If we open my composition settings, you'll see it's 1920 by 1080 HD. And in there, I have a piece of red footage, which is massive. If I zoom out, using comma and period on the keyboard, allow me to zoom in and zoom out of the composition, you'll see that the piece of footage is represented by this frame here. So you can see the red footage is much bigger than my composition. Now, if you can afford to shoot on red and you're outputting for HD, it means that you can pan around this image and start to show different people in the image move from one person to the other, get some really nice effects. So you can shoot super wide and then use the wide shot and zoom into it to get a little bit more detail. And that's what we're going to do here. Now, if you were to use position, which people would most naturally assume to animate to do that, you would end up doing this. You'd think, right, okay, I want to start over here on one of the faces over here. So you end up moving around like this. You find the person you want to start on. So we'll maybe start on this person here. And then I say, okay, now I want to zoom in. So I'm going to open up scale. And you'll notice that as I zoom in, that person goes out of the shot. And that's because the anchor point is in the middle of the layer. Okay? So a couple of things. Instead of doing that, instead of having to search around for the people that we want to view by just moving the image around inside the frame, what we can do is just reset our position. So I'm going to right click and say reset position. And then I'm going to double click the layer. And that's going to open it up in my layer panel where we can see the entire layer. Now, at the moment, it looks very squished, and you'll notice that none of the effects are applied. The first thing I'm going to do is fix the squishness by toggling my pixel aspect ratio correction button. And that now shows me at the correct pixel aspect ratio. I'm then going to drag it to the side of my composition panel in the same frame as my project panel, so I can see both side by side. And we start to see the benefit of working in the layer panel. My comp panel gives me an overview of what my output's going to be, but in my layer panel, I can clearly see all of the content, so I don't need to move the layer around in order to see the different people within the shot. Now, if I want to select one of these people, instead of having to move the layer here, what I can do is actually move the anchor point here. And you'll notice that as I drag the anchor point, whoever's face I drag the anchor point onto becomes the central person within the shot. So if I want to start on this person here, I can move the anchor point over there. You can see I need to scale up a little bit to fill the frame. So let me just put that on fit up to 100% so you can see that. So when I scale up now, the nice thing is I scale up around that anchor point. So we're not losing the position of my character. He's staying in the center. So I could say, okay, at that point, I want to be at that place. So then I start to have to animate my anchor point, which we're going to have a look at in the next lesson. But for now, what I want to do is just have a look at this menu down here. At the moment, we're viewing the anchor point. It's showing us where the anchor point is. If I drag on this view menu, I can open it up and I can look at other things. I could look at the fill color that's being used to colorize the footage and see that in isolation. Now, if we select the footage and hit E on the keyboard, you'll see there is my fill color. Now, it's not that interesting with fill color, but if we then go to something like calculations, we can see how calculations affects the footage. And if I need to, I could open up my effect control panel and make adjustments to that without having to wait for the other things to render, like tint and noise, for example. I could go into tint, see how that affects my footage, go into noise and see how that affects my footage. So it allows me access to the individual controls from the effects within the layer panel, so I can see them rendering one by one. Now, if I was to add something like a lens flare, so let's type in lens and drag lens flare onto here, that would also appear. So that's now my lens flare. What I'm going to do is just set that up first of all in the composition panel, and I'm going to put it on his hand. Okay, and let's do a little bit of animation. Let's say, okay, let's animate the center of the flare from there, and let's go forward a little bit, move it down to there so it follows his hand. Okay, so we've got a little bit of animation going on there. Can also just move it up there at that point. So we're creating a rough track onto his hand. Now, if I want to adjust that in the composition panel and I've got lots of layers, every time I make a change, I'll be having to not only wait for all of these effects to update, but also the layers in the comp. If I go to the layer panel, I can just view the lens flare in isolation, and I can actually get a motion path for it. So I can start to adjust that motion path without having to move through the footage. I can see clearly where I want the motion path to go for the lens flare. So that's another benefit for working in the layer panel. It gives you access to controls for effect properties, effect position properties that you wouldn't normally get when you work in the composition panel. You'll see here all I get is an indicator of where it is now, whereas in the layer panel I actually get a path that I can go in and adjust. I can select the Convert Vertex tool, make changes to the path, make it a curved path if I want to. So being able to adjust effects in the layer panel just gives me much more flexibility and will also take less time to render than doing it in the composition panel.